minor audiovisual glitches, it looks like we're ready to go. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to say a few words of thanks to the people who made this evening's presentation possible. First and foremost, the Department of English and Philosophy and the AUM Lectures program were very generous in their financial support of tonight's event. And I'm also grateful for the support of the University Honors Program and the AUM Office of Global Initiatives. To give just a little bit of background, in the summer of 2013, the University Honors Program made it possible for Dr. Elizabeth Woodworth and myself to teach a course on the writings of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and a handful of other authors known collectively as the Inklings. That was sponsored by the Honors Program, and the Office of Global Initiatives, along with the Honors Program, made it possible for the students in that course to travel to England for a week, to walk where the Inklings walked, to breathe the air that they breathe, and get a sense for the world that shaped so much of their life and thought. In the summer of 2014, the English and Philosophy Department made it possible for us to teach a different version of the same course. And once again, the Office of Global Initiatives sponsored the trip, and we took about a dozen AUM students with us across the pond to Oxford. One of the highlights of that trip was going to C.S. Lewis's home, the Kilns in Headington, England, just outside of Oxford, where we heard a presentation from one of the world's leading C.S. Lewis scholars. I say that without any fear of exaggeration. This man to my left here, with his back to you, is in fact, in addition to being a tech guru, one of the leading lights of C.S. Lewis scholarship. Dr. Michael Ward holds degrees in English language and literature, theology, and divinity from the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and St. Andrews, respectively. He has published multiple significant works on C.S. Lewis's ideas and his writings, most prominent among them being the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis and Planet Narnia, published in 2008 by Oxford University Press. I won't belabor the point any further. Michael, if you are ready. Yes. All right. Then would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Montgomery? Good evening. Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Good. Right. I will try and project. How marvellous that I always travel with my own safety net projector. I take that everywhere I go, and it's never let me down. Thank you to my projector. Thank you all for coming. The heavens are telling the glory of God. The firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech. Night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. Those are the opening verses of Psalm 19. C.S. Lewis, pictured here on the cover of Time in the 1940s, described Psalm 19 as the greatest poem in the book of Psalms and one of the finest lyrics in the world. And it's about Lewis's understanding of the heavens, particularly the seven heavens of the medieval cosmos, that I want to speak to you tonight. How long have we got, Matt?
As long as you need, but about an hour.
Okay, well I'll speak for within an hour. I'm sure I'll keep within 60 minutes, and then we can have some questions and answers and discussion until, I don't know, 8:30, something like that. Is that okay? If you need to leave before then, I will quite understand. So, I'm going to look at the seven heavens in particular as they relate to C.S. Lewis's best-known works. The Seven Chronicles of Narnia, which he published one per year from 1950 to 1956. These books are still selling incredibly well. I'm told they may sell as many as 3 million copies annually worldwide in over 40 different languages. So they are some of the best-selling, most influential works of the second half of the 20th century, and the recent movie adaptations have introduced them to a whole new generation of readers.
Not that the films are much good, if you ask me. But we needn't get into that. Can I just do a quick survey, please, and ask you how many of you have read at least one of these books or seen at least one of the movies? Thank you very much. Who didn't put up their hand? Not a single person has no familiarity with these books. That's great. Usually one sheepish hand goes up. But that's great. With absolute unanimity, 100% success rate. There aren't many books or series of books about which you could ask such a question and get such a positive response rate. That's amazing. I'm assuming that you read these books, you see these movies because you have some sort of pleasure in the Narnia world as Lewis created it, but I wonder if you have ever sort of sat back from your enjoyment of these books and asked yourself, why did C.S. Lewis write these tales the way that he did? When Lewis read aloud the first few chapters of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe to his great friend J.R.R.R. Tolkien, Tolkien hated what he heard. Did you know this? Tolkien strongly detested the way Lewis had assembled The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe out of what he, Tolkien, regarded as incompatible mythological traditions. English children, fresh from the pages of an E. Nesbit story, a white witch character who seems very much to be based on a snow queen out of Hans Andersen, centaurs, fauns, naiads and dryads, and other characters out of Greek and Roman mythology, alongside Father Christmas. For goodness sake, what is he doing in his story? Tolkien thought this was an abomination, and he soon gave up trying to read the books after they began to be published. He later confessed that they were entirely outside his range of imaginative sympathy. Now, C.S. Lewis loved Middle-earth, and if it hadn't been for Lewis's endless encouragement of Tolkien, Tolkien almost certainly would never have finished writing The Lord of the Rings. He says as much. Or, if he had finished writing it, he would perhaps never have offered it for publication. Because it was only Lewis who ever convinced Tolkien that there would be an audience for the kind of thing that he, Tolkien, was writing. So Lewis loved Middle-earth. Tolkien hated Narnia. They had a real love-hate relationship. And because Tolkien has become so famous, his attitude to Narnia has also become very well known. Lots of people have mistakenly assumed that Tolkien knew very well what he was talking about when he described the books as a bit of a hodgepodge, a mishmash. On the surface, at any rate, Tolkien's attitude is understandable, because indeed the books do seem to be assembled out of very various literary traditions. But it's not really plausible that Lewis should have thrown the books together any old how without any underlying pattern or coherence, because he was a very rigorous and consistent thinker who never did anything by accident. One of his friends said of him that what Lewis thought about everything was somehow secretly present in what he said about anything. He wasn't a random or a slapdash or a haphazard kind of writer or thinker. If you know Lewis's poetry, his poetry is fantastically complex. I mean, mind-bogglingly complex. You look at some of Lewis's poems, you think you've worked out their rhyme scheme and their meter. Then you look a bit more closely and you find a whole other dimension of complexity beneath the one you first noticed. Lewis said that he was enamored of metrical and phonetic subtleties. And the poems which look as if they're in free verse are often in the most complicated meters of all. As a medieval scholar, Lewis loved studying the writings of Dante, Chaucer, Milton, Spencer, writers, he said, who loved to present us with something which can't be taken in at a glance. Everything leads to everything else in these writers, he says, but often by very intricate paths. Complexity, he says, is a mark of the medieval mind. These writers love to present us with something which at first looks planless, though all is planned. And then as a Christian too, Lewis believed that the universe itself is a fantastically intricate work of divine artistry. Every single thing in creation, he thought, has been made for a purpose. We may not necessarily be able to work out what that purpose is, but he believes it exists in the mind of God. God is working his purposes out. Even in seemingly random things, Lewis says, like the curve of every wave and the flight of every insect. That's how he puts it in his book on prayer. Lewis's complex poetry, his love of complex medieval literature, his beliefs in God's divine complex artistry and creation. You turn back to Narnia and the idea that the books were just thrown together without much pattern or design, and that idea becomes much less plausible. So quite a lot of Lewis scholars have said there must be a further level of complexity beneath the surface one. And the obvious place to look, of course, is the biblical parallels within the series. Lewis himself once said that the whole Narnia series is about Christ. The whole Narnia series is about Christ, he says, and the Christ character, Aslan, the Lion King, he is indeed the only character who appears in all 7 books, and he's very Christ-like, especially in these 3 stories. In The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, we have a Narnian version of the gospel story, Christ dying and rising in order to redeem a sinner. In The Magician's Nephew, we have a Narnian version of the creation story. And in The Last Battle, we have a Narnian version of the apocalypse. So we have the Redeemer, the Creator, the Judge, those Christological, those theological divine offices represented in these 3 tales. You can't miss these parallels if you've got any sort of biblical knowledge at all. But these are only 3 out of 7 books, less than half the series. What about the other 4? In these 4 stories, Aslan is still present, yes, and he's still Christ-like in various ways. He teaches people, he guides people, challenges people, suffers for people. But there's no major element or episode of Christ's life or ministry that's being reimagined in these 4 stories. I mean, you might have expected Lewis to give us a whole Narnia story devoted to the birth of Aslan into Narnia. Aslan becoming a lion cub in Narnia, like Jesus is born into Bethlehem as a baby, but you don't have that. You don't have a Narnian version of the ascension of Christ. You don't have a Narnian Pentecost. Why not? You might have expected those sorts of things, given what he has done in these 3. But in these 4, what do you get? You have Aslan entering the story of Prince Caspian amongst dancing trees before giving a great war cry. In the Dawn Trevor, Aslan is seen flying in a sunbeam. In the Silver Chair, he doesn't actually come down to Narnia at all. He's confined to his own high country above the clouds, which doesn't seem a very Christian way of depicting your Christ character. He's still up in heaven, but isn't incarnated into the magical world. And in The Horse and His Boy, he's mistaken for 2 lions, or maybe 3 lions, and he does a great deal of dashing about in that story. You remember he says, there was only 1 lion, but he was swift of foot. Okay, so why has Lewis chosen to make his Christ character swift of foot? I don't recall Jesus in the Gospels being a notable sprinter, or having a special ministry to athletes. Why has Lewis made that imaginative choice? These are interesting questions. So when we look at the Narnia series from this biblical, theological point of view, in order to find a more coherent pattern and design to the series, well, we fare quite satisfactorily for 3 of the books and less satisfactorily for the other 4. We don't seem to have arrived at that level of complexity and intricacy which we could have expected from a writer so enamored of subtleties and complexities. And that has caused quite a lot of Lewis scholars and critics to go looking for an additional level of complexity within the series. Not just the surface story, not just the biblical parallels, but some deep structure, some fundamental kind of imaginative DNA to the series. All sorts of different theories have been suggested, like the 7 deadly sins, for instance, the 7 sacraments, the 7 books of Spenser's Fairy Queen, one of Lewis's favourite poems, the 7 virtues, the 7 dwarfs. Not very surprised. None of these theories has made any real sense. It hasn't convinced anybody, and most of the people who have even come up with these ideas haven't advanced them very seriously. I myself once made a half-hearted attempt to link the Chronicles to different plays by Shakespeare, but I soon abandoned that idea. You always know as a literary critic when you're trying to crowbar an idea into a literary text. This didn't get me very far, so I abandoned that. And it was when I wasn't looking for it that I believe I stumbled across the real answer to this imaginative puzzle that the Narnia Chronicles present. I was halfway through my PhD looking at Lewis's theological imagination at the time. I'll come back to the precise circumstances of this eureka moment later on in the talk. For now, it's sufficient just to say that I wrote up my dissertation and Oxford University Press published it as this book, Planet Narnia, a few years ago. The BBC then got interested and commissioned a television documentary about it called The Narnia Code. Please excuse that title. There's now a book, same title. Narnia Code is a shorter version of Planet Narnia. Narnia Code is also available on DVD if you want. And it's the substance of this discovery, as I believe it to be, that I want to share with you tonight. But it's a very big claim that I'm making, that there is indeed a secret governing imaginative blueprint to the Narnia Chronicles, which he told nobody about, and which nobody noticed for 50 or 60 years until I came along. You know, that's a very arrogant claim. And you would be right to be skeptical about it. I would be skeptical if anybody came to me with such a claim. But hear me out, because the evidence begins to stack up when you look at it. Nonetheless, it is a big claim. So before we come on to the substance of the argument itself, I want to give you 5 background reasons why Lewis might have done this thing. Once we've got these 5 background points in place, it will hopefully be less surprising that Lewis should have done this. Indeed, we will come to see, I hope, that we should not only allow Lewis to do something like this, but really we might expect him to do it. So, of these 5 background reasons, the first has to do with Lewis himself, his own psychology, his own character and temperament. He could be very secretive when he wanted to be. George Sayer, who knew Lewis for 30 years, first as a pupil, then as a friend, said, "Jack never ceased to be secretive." You know, by the way, that Jack was Lewis's nickname. He didn't like to be called Clive, and he didn't like to be called Staples. So he always went by Jack. So Jack never ceased to be secretive. This is the verdict of a man who knew Lewis very well indeed, over 30 years. He never ceased to be secretive. And the most obvious example of his secretiveness is his marriage. When he got married in his late 50s, he kept his marriage secret for the best part of a year. Have you seen the film Shadowlands? You know about this part of his biography. He marries this American woman, Joy Davidman, and he tells nobody that he's done so for the best part of a year. Not even close friends like Tolkien are told. Now, a man who can keep his marriage secret can keep anything secret. But there are many other examples of his secretiveness too. I mean, his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, left out so many important things that one of his other friends jokingly said it should not have been called Surprised by Joy. It should have been called Suppressed by Jack. So here is a man who would be very guarded, very private, very compartmentalized, very secretive when he wants to be. Of course, this proves nothing about Narnia. I'm not saying that because he kept his marriage secret, therefore there's a secret to Narnia. I'm just saying this is the kind of man we're dealing with. This is his temperament, this is his psychology, if you like. He can keep secrets when he wants to. So that's the first point, the psychology. Secondly, epistemology. Epistemology is the science of how we know things, the study of consciousness. And Lewis once said that an influence which can't evade our consciousness won't go very deep. An influence which can't evade our consciousness won't go very deep. Let me give you a very quick summary of how he understood consciousness. He divided it into two modes, and he writes about this in a little article called Meditation in a Tool Shed, where he pictures himself standing in the darkness of his tool shed one sunny day. It's dark inside, but it's bright outside this shed, and through a crack at the top of the door, he can see a beam of light slanting down through the darkness of the shed. He can see little particles of dust floating in the sunbeam. It lights up a patch of the floor. And this is his image of one kind of consciousness that we have. He calls it contemplation, looking at the beam. The sort of knowledge you have of a thing when you are outside it, inspecting it from a distance. You are neutral, you are detached, you're a disinterested observer. That's one way in which we know things. Then he shifts his position so that the beam of light is now falling no longer on the floor, but directly on his eyeballs. And instantly, he said, the whole picture changed. He no longer saw the tool shed. Most significantly, he no longer even saw the beam of light, because he now saw along the beam of light. And by looking along it, he saw the crack at the top of the door, the leaves on the tree waving in the wind outside, and millions of miles away, the sun itself. And this, of course, is his image of the second kind of consciousness that we have, which he calls enjoyment, looking along the beam. This is the sort of knowledge we have of a thing when we are inside it, when we are committed to it. We're not holding it at arm's length, we're taking it close. And the distinction between contemplation and enjoyment is very similar to the distinction you find in many languages, in the two verbs to know. In Spanish, saber and conocer, or in French, savoir and connaître. Knowledge about something from the outside, knowledge of something from the inside. And Lewis's purpose in this little meditation is really to encourage us to try out every question that presents itself to us in both modes, in both types of consciousness. He says we should be like the ancient Persians, who debated everything twice. Once when they were sober, and once when they were drunk. There are benefits to our knowledge of being drunk. That is to say, of being inside an experience, of stepping into it, of allowing yourself to be disinhibited, of allowing the thing to get beneath the radar of your cool, detached, contemplative consciousness and sink down into the deeper enjoyment consciousness. So that's what he means when he says an influence which can't evade our consciousness won't go very deep. He means an influence which can't evade our dry, detached, contemplative consciousness won't go very deep. The deeper knowledge we have of a thing is the enjoyment when we're committed. We're not holding it at arm's length, we're bringing it close. Think of it in connection with relationships you might want to have or that you have. What would you rather do? Read an article about someone on Wikipedia or be in a relationship with them personally? I suppose it would depend on the person. But all things being equal, you get a much deeper knowledge of a person by being in a relationship with them, with the connoisseur knowledge, not just the saber. But the interesting thing is that when you look along the beam vanishes. That's the point for our present purposes, that enjoyment consciousness involves a kind of hiddenness or invisibility. You don't look at the beam, you look along the beam. It's not the object of your vision, it's now the medium of your vision. Light is not so much something we see as it is something we see by. But when you look along the beam, you can't see it. You can only see that which it illuminates. So that's our second point, epistemology. Now we move on to theology, and especially Christology, the doctrine of Christ. Lewis was interested in this verse from the New Testament. For all things were created through Christ and for Christ, and in Christ all things hold together. He was sufficiently interested in this verse to paraphrase it in one of his books. He paraphrases it as, Christ is the all-pervasive principle of cohesion, whereby the universe holds together. Now, remember, Lewis says the whole Narnia series is about Christ. When we hear Lewis say that, we tend to think immediately of Aslan and that particular individual character, the lion, who goes about doing Christ-like things. That's all well and good. But what about this aspect of Christ, the cosmic Christ, the omnipresent Christ, the one in whom all things hold together? How would Lewis communicate that aspect of Christ if he was wanting to get that into his stories as well? That's a much harder thing to communicate, but it's equally part of the biblical picture. Why is it so hard to communicate? Because it's in every part of the story. All things hold together in Christ in this sense, including our very understanding of Christ. That too is held together by him and in him. And that puts us into something of a predicament. We can't, in that sense, step outside Christ and look back at him as if from some Christ-less vantage point. There is no such vantage point, because all things hold together in Christ. To try to step into that Christless position would be to step into the void. It can't be done. And as I say, it puts us into something of a predicament which Lewis homes in on in his book Miracles, where he says, the fact which is in one respect the most obvious and primary fact, that is to say God, Christ, and through which alone you have access to all the other facts, may be precisely the one that is most easily forgotten. Forgotten not because it's so remote or abstruse, but because it's so near and so obvious. And that is exactly how the supernatural has been forgotten. The divine nature, the supernatural, has been forgotten because it is closer to us than we are to ourselves. It's this side of knowledge. It's that thing by which we know anything at all. And therefore, it's very difficult to bring it to contemplative consciousness. You can't really do that. You are within the beam of this Christ-drenched universe at every second, in every place. You can only look along this beam. You can never really look at it. You can't jump off your own shadow. So, thinking back to the meditation in the tool shelf, this very understanding of Christ is itself a kind of hidden presence or invisible presence. We have to remember that we're enjoying Christ even before we ever think about contemplating the incarnate Christ, Jesus the Son of God, that singular, historical, particular figure who moves about the stage of the world doing things to people, for people, 2,000 years ago. He's also the discarnate, or the pre-incarnate Word, who's holding all things together at once. He exists in two modes, you might say. It's obvious to us how Aslan depicts Christ in the Narnia books. What about the depiction of the cosmic Christ? Where is that to be seen? Just be seen along. Okay, that's our third background point. Now, fourthly, a literary point. The kappa element in romance. This is the title of an essay Lewis wrote about stories. Romance here means story, adventure stories. It's nothing to do with love affairs. And kappa is the initial letter of the Greek word krypton, meaning cryptic or hidden. So the title of his essay basically means the hidden element in story. Lewis wrote an essay with the title, The Hidden Element in Story. It should alert us to the possibility that Narnia might have more going on in it than meets the eye. The thing is, he never published this essay under this title, so most people don't know about it. He later wrote it up under a different title and published it as On Stories, in which he says this: to be stories at all, stories must be series of events. But it must be understood that this series, or plot as we call it, is only really a net whereby to catch something else. The real theme may be, and perhaps usually is, something that has no sequence in it, something other than a process, and much more like a state or a quality. So the hidden element of a story is this qualitative aspect to it, this atmosphere which runs through every part of it. It's not just the plot that you like in your favourite stories, it's not just what happens, it's the whole world in which these things happen. You just like being in that world, you like breathing the atmosphere, the oxygen of that imagined world. That's why you go back and back to your favourite stories many times. You haven't forgotten what happens. You can remember the plot okay, you just want to relive the events and the whole experience of moving about that imagined world. Quite a good parallel is to be taken from our experience of watching films. You've, I'm sure, many a time been in a movie theatre and the movie has lost your attention and you sink back in your chair, you fold your arms, and you suddenly become aware of the frame of the screen. You ever had that experience? Of course, the frame of the screen has been there all the time, but until the movie lost your attention, you weren't aware of the frame of the screen, because you sort of moved through the screen. You were living in the film. You were caught up in the good storytelling. By the magic of good filmmaking, something disappears, the frame of the screen. And so what we have here in On Stories is a kind of literary equivalent of that. You kind of forget that you're reading a book when you read a story like, say, The Last of the Mohicans. That's Lewis's example. You're caught up into this very persuasive atmosphere. The Three Musketeers, on the other hand, Lewis says is a bad book because it's all plot and no atmosphere. Terribly exciting, rollicking good plot, but where's the weather? The characters go from London to Paris, and there's no sense that Paris is any different from London. It's just endless plot. It's like those movies you see which are all car chases and explosions and shootouts. And you think it's terribly high-octane action, but give us some character. Give us some atmosphere. But interestingly, the atmosphere is effectively hidden from you by the fact that it's in all parts of the story. It's all pervasive. So you see how, again, here in literature, we have a kind of equivalent of enjoyment consciousness. You look along the beam of the deathliness of Hamlet, for instance. That's another of Lewis's examples. That deathly atmosphere that pervades the whole of Hamlet. Only when you close the play or leave the theatre and you reflect upon it afterwards with your contemplative intellect might you think, oh yes, they got the morbidity, the mortality very well in that production. For as long as you're